The autumn rain fell like shards of ice upon the cobblestones of Thornhaven, turning the narrow streets into rivers of mud and filth that swallowed the light of evening torches whole. In the fading grey of that miserable afternoon, when merchants shuttered their windows and goodwives hurried children indoors, a small figure emerged from the tangled warren of poor houses that clung to the northern wall like barnacles to a rotting ship. The boy could not have been more than 7 winters old, his feet bare and bleeding, his tunic torn and hanging from his thin shoulders like the rags of a scarecrow. His face, smeared with dirt and tears, held an expression that would haunt the memories of all who saw him that day, an expression that belonged not to childhood, but to the deepest chambers of human despair. He ran. God in heaven, how he ran! His small legs pumped with desperate fury, splashing through puddles, slipping on wet stone, stumbling and rising again without pause. His breath came in ragged sobs that tore from his throat like the cries of a wounded animal. The few souls still abroad in the streets turned to stare, but the boy saw none of them. His eyes, wild and rimmed with red, fixed upon a single destination, the eastern gatehouse where the king's knights had made their temporary garrison while travelling through the borderlands. He had heard the soldiers speak of them in whispered tones, the Order of the Silver Lion, knights sworn to uphold the king's justice in these wild territories where law crumbled like old parchment at the edges of the realm. The boy's lungs burned with each breath, his vision blurred by rain and tears. But still he ran. Behind him, in the darkness of the poorhouse district, his mother's screams had fallen silent, and that silence drove him forward with more force than any whip. He had hidden in the cellar as she had commanded, wedged between barrels of spoiled grain and broken pottery, but he had heard everything. The heavy boots on the stairs, his mother's voice rising in protest, then fear, then agony. The laughter of men who had forgotten what it meant to be human, the terrible sounds that followed, and then, worst of all, the silence. The gatehouse rose before him like a mountain of stone and iron, its torches sputtering in the rain, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the 2 guards who stood beneath the archway. They were not knights, but men-at-arms, hardened soldiers who had seen their share of misery in these borderlands. Yet when the boy burst into the circle of torchlight and collapsed at their feet, gasping and sobbing, even these weathered men felt something cold grip their hearts. "They're hurting my mother!" The words exploded from the boy's mouth in a wail that seemed to tear the very air. "Please, please, they're hurting my mother. You have to stop them, please!" His small hands grasped at the leather boots of the nearest guard, his fingers leaving streaks of blood on the wet material. "She told me to run, but I heard her screaming, and then she stopped, and I don't know if she's please, you have to help her." The guards exchanged a glance, a moment of silent communication that spoke of 100 similar pleas heard and ignored in towns like this, where justice was a luxury the poor could not afford. But there was something in this boy's eyes, some terrible authenticity of anguish, that pierced through their professional detachment like a blade through rotten wood. "Where, boy?" The first guard knelt, his hand on the child's shoulder. "Where is your mother?" "Poorhouse district, the old tanner's building, 3rd floor. Please hurry, please." The words tumbled out in a flood. "There were 5 of them, maybe 6. I couldn't see them all, but I heard them. I heard what they were doing, and my mother, she tried to fight, but they... The second guard had already turned and was striding into the gatehouse. Moments later, the interior of the structure erupted with activity. Torches flared brighter as more were lit. The sound of armor and weapons being gathered echoed off stone walls. And then they emerged, 5 knights of the Order of the Silver Lion, their faces grim as death itself, their eyes holding that peculiar mixture of controlled fury and iron purpose that marked men who had sworn oaths they intended to keep. At their head walked Sir Aldrich, commander of this small company, a man whose scarred face and grey-streaked beard spoke of 30 years spent in the service of crown and realm. He was not tall, but he carried himself with the bearing of one accustomed to command. And when he looked upon the sobbing child at his feet, something ancient and terrible stirred behind his eyes. He had seen much in his years, perhaps too much, and he had long ago accepted that the world was a cruel place where the innocent suffered while the guilty prospered. But acceptance did not mean approval, and beneath the hardened exterior of the professional soldier beat the heart of a man who still remembered what it meant to care. "Show us," Sir Aldrich said, his voice like gravel sliding across steel. It was not a request. The boy led them through the rain-soaked streets, his bare feet splashing through puddles that reflected the torchlight like pools of liquid fire. The knights followed in grim silence, their mail and plate armor creating a rhythm of metallic whispers that seemed to promise retribution. Citizens who had been hurrying homeward now pressed themselves against walls and into doorways, sensing something in the air, some gathering storm that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the cold purpose radiating from these armed men. The poorhouse district was a maze of leaning buildings and narrow alleys where the poorest of Thornhaven's poor scratched out existences that could barely be called lives. Here, the town watch rarely ventured, and when they did, they walked in groups and kept their hands on their weapons. It was a place where the king's law held no sway, where disputes were settled with fists and knives, where the strong preyed upon the weak without consequence. The knights knew such places existed in every town and city across the realm, festering sores on the body of civilization, and they had long ago learned to accept this as an unfortunate reality of life in a fallen world. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, a child had run to them for help, and they had chosen to answer. The old tanner's building rose before them, a 3-story structure of timber and plaster that leaned drunkenly to one side, as if seeking to escape its own foundation. Light flickered in several windows, and from somewhere within came the sound of raucous laughter and drunken singing. The boy stopped at the entrance, his whole body trembling, his eyes fixed on the dark doorway with an expression of such profound terror that even the hardest of the knights felt something twist in their chests. "Third floor," the boy whispered. "The room at the end of the hall. That's where we lived, just me and my mother." Sir Aldrich placed his hand on the boy's head, a gesture that was surprisingly gentle coming from such a weathered warrior. "Stay here with Sir Marcus," he commanded. "What happens next is not for your eyes." The boy opened his mouth to protest, but something in the knight's face silenced him. He nodded mutely and allowed himself to be led aside by the youngest of the knights, a man barely past 20, whose face still held traces of the innocence that would soon be forever burned away by what he was about to witness. The remaining 4 knights entered the building, their movements precise and coordinated, in the way of men who had fought together for years and knew each other's minds as well as their own. The interior was dark and reeked of rot and human waste, the walls slick with moisture and covered in mold that glowed faintly in the torchlight. They climbed the stairs in silence, their boots making soft thuds on the wooden steps, their breathing controlled and steady despite the fury that sang in their veins like poison. On the 3rd floor, they found the hallway exactly as the boy had described, a narrow corridor lined with doors, most hanging open to reveal rooms empty of everything except despair. At the far end, light spilled from beneath a closed door, and from beyond it came the sounds that confirmed every terrible thing the boy had told them. Men's voices, slurred with drink and thick with cruelty, the sound of furniture being overturned. And beneath it all, a soft whimpering that might have been mistaken for an animal in pain had they not known better. Sir Aldrich did not knock. He did not announce their presence or demand surrender. He simply raised his armored boot and kicked the door with such force that it exploded inward in a shower of splinters, the hinges tearing free from the rotted wood like paper. The knights poured through the opening in a practiced assault formation, and what they found in that room would fuel their nightmares for years to come. The space was small and squalid, lit by a single guttering candle and the dying embers of a fire that had burned low in a cracked hearth. In one corner lay an overturned table and the shattered remains of what had once been simple furniture, a chair, a stool, a small chest for storing clothes. Against the far wall, 6 men stood or sat in various states of drunkenness and depravity, their clothes disheveled, bottles of cheap wine scattered around them like the refuse of some infernal celebration. And on the floor, curled into a ball in the center of the room like a broken bird, lay the boy's mother. She was perhaps 30 years old, though suffering had aged her beyond her years. Her dress was torn nearly to ribbons, her face swollen and bloodied, her arms wrapped protectively around herself as she rocked back and forth in a motion that spoke of a mind trying desperately to escape a reality too terrible to bear. Her eyes, when they lifted to see the knights burst into the room, held no hope, no relief, only the blank stare of one who has gazed too long into the abyss and found it staring back. The 6 men turned, their faces initially registering confusion, then fear as they recognized the armor and tabards of the king's knights. One of them, a fat man with a scarred cheek and the bearing of a merchant gone to seed, attempted to speak, his wine-thick tongue stumbling over words of explanation or excuse. Another reached for a knife at his belt, an instinct born of panic rather than any real hope of resistance. They never had a chance to do more. Sir Aldrich moved with a speed that belied his years, his sword clearing its scabbard in a single fluid motion that seemed to make the very air sing. The blade, 3 feet of castle-forged steel that had been honed to an edge that could split hairs, took the knife-reaching man across the throat before he could complete his draw. Blood erupted in a dark fountain that painted the wall behind him in a grotesque fresco, and the man collapsed, his hands grasping uselessly at the ruin of his neck, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. The other knights spread through the room like wolves among sheep, and what followed was not a battle, but an execution. These were not hardened warriors they faced, but cowards and rapists, men who found their courage in numbers and in preying upon the helpless. Faced with trained killers in full armor, they had no more chance than lambs in a slaughterhouse. Sir Gareth, a knight whose gentle face concealed the heart of a berserker, seized the fat merchant by his collar and drove him backward into the wall with such force that the timber frame cracked audibly. The man's protests turned to screams as the knight's armored fist rose and fell, each blow punctuated by the sound of breaking bone and cartilage. Blood and teeth scattered across the floor like macabre confetti, and still the knight did not stop. Could not stop, his face contorted with a rage that had been building throughout the long walk through the rain. 2 of the other men attempted to flee, pushing past their fellows in their panic, making for the shattered doorway. Sir Brennan, the tallest of the knights, caught the first with a backhand swing of his mailed fist that sent the man sprawling, his jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. The second made it as far as the hallway before the knight's boot found his spine, driving him face first into the rotten floorboards with a crack that echoed through the building. The man tried to rise, blood pouring from his shattered nose, but the knight's boot found his ribs, then his head, then his ribs again, each impact driving more breath and more life from his body. The remaining 3 men huddled against the far wall, their hands raised in supplication, their voices babbling pleas for mercy that fell on ears that had ceased to hear anything but the woman's whimpers and the memory of a child's desperate cries. Sir Aldrich approached them slowly, his sword still dripping with the blood of the first man he had killed. His face, scarred and weathered by years of war, held no expression at all, and somehow that was more terrifying than any display of rage could have been. "Mercy," one of them whimpered, a young man barely out of his teens whose fine clothes marked him as the son of some local burgher or minor noble. "Please, we were drunk, we didn't mean, we'll pay for the damage, we'll..." "You'll die," Sir Aldrich said quietly, and his sword moved again. What followed was methodical and terrible. The knights showed no more emotion than butchers at their work, and indeed that is what this was, a butchering of human animals who had forfeited their right to be called men. They did not make it quick. Each of the remaining 3 men died slowly, painfully, their screams echoing through the poorhouse and out into the rainy streets where a crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the sounds of violence and retribution. When it was finished, when the last of the 6 men had been silenced forever, the room looked like the floor of an abattoir. Blood pooled on the warped floorboards and dripped through the cracks to the rooms below. Bodies lay in positions that defied the usual arrangement of human limbs, broken and shattered beyond any hope of recognition. The knights stood among the carnage, their armor splattered with gore, their breathing heavy but controlled, the fury that had driven them slowly cooling into something darker and more contemplative. Sir Aldrich turned to where the woman still lay curled against the wall. He sheathed his sword and approached her slowly, carefully, as one might approach a wounded deer, his hands held out to show he meant no harm. When he knelt beside her, his armored knees splashing in the blood that covered the floor, he saw her eyes were open but unseeing, her mind having retreated to some inner sanctuary where the horrors of the world could not reach. "My lady," he said softly, his voice gentle in a way that would have surprised those who knew him only as a warrior. "You are safe now. They cannot hurt you any more. Your son, your brave son, he brought us to you. He saved your life." At the mention of her son, something flickered in the woman's eyes, some spark of awareness struggling back toward consciousness. Her lips moved, forming words that barely carried sound. "Tam, is he safe?" "He is safe," Sir Aldrich assured her. "Sir Marcus watches over him below. He is unharmed." Tears began to flow down the woman's battered face, carving clean lines through the dirt and blood. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The words came as a litany, a prayer of gratitude to these grim angels of vengeance who had answered her son's desperate plea. The knight removed his cloak, a heavy wool garment lined with fur, and wrapped it carefully around the woman's shaking form. Then, with surprising gentleness for such a large man encumbered by armor, he lifted her in his arms as one might carry a sleeping child. She weighed almost nothing, her body wasted by poverty and hardship, and as he carried her from that chamber of horrors, he found himself thinking of his own mother, long dead these 20 years, and wondering if there had been anyone to save her when bandits had burned their village at the war's beginning. They emerged from the building to find the street crowded with onlookers, dozens of the district's residents drawn by the commotion, and standing now in the rain, their faces illuminated by torchlight, their expressions a mixture of fear, awe, and something that might have been hope. The boy, Tam, broke free from Sir Marcus and ran to his mother, his small hands reaching up to touch her face, to confirm that she still lived. "Mother, Mother, are you all right? I brought help. I brought the knights like you always said I should if there was trouble. Mother, please say something." The woman's hand, trembling and weak, reached down to stroke her son's wet hair. "You did well, my brave boy," she managed. "You did so well." Sir Aldrich carried the woman to the gatehouse, the crowd parting before the knights like water before the prow of a ship. No one spoke, no one dared to question what had occurred or what justice had been dispensed. They had heard the screams, had seen the knights enter and emerge, and they understood that something had happened in that building that would be spoken of in whispers for years to come, a tale of what befell those who preyed upon the innocent when true justice finally arrived. At the gatehouse, the knights laid the woman on a cot in the guardroom and sent for the town's physician, a sour old man who grumbled about being roused at such an hour, but who nevertheless attended to her injuries with professional efficiency. He cleaned and bandaged her wounds, gave her a draught to ease the pain and help her sleep, and pronounced that while her body would heal, the wounds to her spirit might take far longer to mend, if they ever did. The boy never left his mother's side, curling up next to her on the narrow cot, his small body pressed against hers as if to shield her from any further harm. Sir Aldrich watched them from across the room, his face unreadable, his thoughts his own. Around him, the other knights cleaned their weapons and armor, the sound of steel on whetstone, a familiar ritual that helped to settle their minds after the violence of the evening. "That was well done," Sir Gareth said quietly, approaching his commander. "Those men deserved what they received." "Perhaps," Sir Aldrich replied, his voice distant, "but I wonder sometimes if we are any different from them, if our violence is sanctified merely because we claim the authority of crown and law. We are different because we fight for those who cannot fight for themselves," Sir Gareth insisted. "That boy ran to us because he believed we would help, because he had faith that there was still justice in this world. If we had turned him away, if we had told him that his mother's suffering was not our concern, what message would that send? That might makes right, that the strong may prey upon the weak without consequence?" Sir Aldrich nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in his companion's words. "You are right, of course, and yet I cannot help but feel that what we did tonight, that butchery, even in service of justice, it takes something from us. Some piece of our humanity that we can never get back. That is the price we pay," Sir Gareth said simply, "so that others need not." The night wore on, the rain eventually easing to a drizzle and then stopping altogether. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with streaks of grey and pink, the woman stirred and woke. She looked around in confusion at first, then her eyes found her son sleeping beside her, and something in her expression eased. When she saw Sir Aldrich sitting across the room, still armoured, still watchful, she attempted to sit up. "Rest, my lady," the knight commanded gently. "You are safe here. No one will harm you." "Those men," she began, then stopped, her voice catching. "Are they—" "They will never hurt anyone again," Sir Aldrich said firmly. "That much I can promise you." The woman closed her eyes, and whether what she felt was relief or horror, or some mixture of both, the knight could not say. "Thank you," she whispered finally. "I know that thanks are not enough, that there are no words sufficient to repay what you have done for us, but thank you." "No thanks are necessary," Sir Aldrich replied. "We did only what was right, what our oaths demand of us. But I must ask, what will you do now? You cannot return to that place, and I fear that the families of those men, when they learn what has become of their sons and brothers, they may seek revenge." The woman's face paled at this, and she looked down at her sleeping son with an expression of such profound fear that it pained the knight to witness. "I don't know," she admitted. "We have nowhere to go, no family, no coin. I worked as a laundress, but the pay was barely enough to keep us in that hovel. And now I don't know if I can even—" She broke off, unable to finish the sentence, and Sir Aldrich understood. The assault had broken something in her, had stolen not just her dignity but her confidence, her ability to face the world without fear. How could she walk the streets again, knowing what men were capable of? How could she trust anyone, accept help from anyone, when help had come too late to prevent the violation that would haunt her for the rest of her days? The knight was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then he made a decision, one that he knew his superiors might question, but which his conscience demanded. "Listen to me carefully," he said, leaning forward. "My order maintains a sanctuary, a place for those who have suffered injustice and have nowhere else to turn. It is 3 days' ride to the north, near the monastery of St. Wulfric. There, you and your son would be safe, would be cared for, would be given the chance to heal and to build new lives. I can provide you with a letter of introduction to the Mother Superior, and I can arrange for an escort to take you there safely." The woman stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You would do this? For us? But why?" "We are nothing, no one important. Just You are a mother who suffered a terrible wrong, and your son is a boy who showed courage beyond his years," Sir Aldrich interrupted. "That is reason enough. The Order of the Silver Lion was founded to protect the innocent and uphold justice, and that is what we shall do. You have my word, and the word of my knights, that you will be cared for." Tears flowed freely down the woman's face now, tears of relief and gratitude that seemed to wash away some of the pain that lingered in her eyes. "Bless you," she sobbed. "God bless you and all your men. You are truly knights of heaven." "We are only men," Sir Aldrich said quietly, "doing what we believe is right. Nothing more, nothing less." 3 days later, as the first snows of winter began to fall across the borderlands, a small caravan departed from Thornhaven. At its center rode the woman and her son, wrapped in warm cloaks provided by the knights, seated on horses that had been purchased from the town's stable. Around them rode 4 knights of the Silver Lion, their armor gleaming even in the grey winter light, their eyes watchful for any threat that might emerge from the forests and hills. Sir Aldrich stood in the gatehouse and watched them go, his hand raised in farewell, as the boy turned back one last time to wave, his small face bright with something that looked almost like joy. The knight remained there long after they had disappeared from sight, thinking about justice and mercy, about violence and its consequences, about the choices that defined a man's life and the oaths that gave it meaning. Behind him, in the poorhouse district, the old tanner's building stood empty and silent. The bodies had been removed, given over to the town authorities for whatever burial the families deemed appropriate. There had been questions, of course, demands from angry relatives and nervous magistrates who worried about the precedent of knights taking the law into their own hands. But Sir Aldrich had submitted his report to his order's commanders, and they had reviewed it and deemed his actions justified under the authority granted to them by the King's Charter. The matter was closed, at least officially, but in the taverns and marketplaces of Thornhaven the story lived on. It was told in whispers at first, then more openly as the winter deepened and the memory of those 6 men faded into the past. The tale grew in the telling, as such tales always do, acquiring embellishments and details that may or may not have been true. But at its heart remained the essential truth, that a boy had run through the rain crying for help, that knights had answered his plea, and that justice, swift and terrible and absolute, had been dispensed upon those who had thought themselves beyond its reach. Years later, when Tam was grown into a young man and training to become a knight himself, having been sponsored by the Order of the Silver Lion in recognition of his courage on that terrible night, he would sometimes think back to those moments when he had run through the rain, his feet bleeding, his lungs burning, his mind filled with nothing but desperate hope that someone, anyone, would help. His mother. He would remember the faces of the knights who had emerged from the gatehouse like avenging angels, their eyes hard as flint, their purpose clear as crystal. He would remember how Sir Aldrich had carried his mother so gently, how the old knight had shown them mercy when mercy was not owed, had given them a future when all seemed lost. And he would understand, in a way that perhaps only those who have known true helplessness can understand, why the order existed, why men took oaths to defend the innocent and uphold justice, even when the cost was high and the rewards were few. He would understand that evil flourished when good men did nothing, and that sometimes mercy meant being willing to do terrible things to terrible people so that the innocent might be spared. The sanctuary near St. Wulfric's monastery became home to Tam and his mother for 5 years. There in that peaceful valley where the order maintained gardens and workshops and small cottages for those under its protection, the woman slowly healed. Her body recovered first, the bruises fading, the broken bones mending, the cuts scarring over into thin white lines that served as a permanent reminder of what she had endured. Her spirit took longer, much longer, And there were nights when she woke screaming, nights when she could not bear to be touched even by her own son, nights when the darkness seemed to close in around her with suffocating weight. But she survived. With the help of the other women in the sanctuary, survivors themselves of various injustices and cruelties, she learned to live with her memories rather than being consumed by them. She learned to smile again, to laugh, to take joy in simple things, like the first flowers of spring, or the taste of fresh bread, or the sound of her son's voice as he studied his letters with the monks. And though she never fully recovered the person she had been before that terrible night, she became someone new, someone stronger and wiser and more compassionate for having known such depths of suffering. When Tam left to begin his training as a knight, she wept but did not try to stop him. She understood that this was his path, that the boy who had run through the rain seeking help for his mother had grown into a young man who wanted to be the one others ran to in their darkest hours. She understood that he carried within him the memory of what the knights had done, the justice they had dispensed, and that he wanted to become part of that legacy. Sir Aldrich attended the ceremony when Tam took his oaths and became a full knight of the Order of the Silver Lion. The old warrior, now bent with age and grey as winter frost, stood in the chapel and watched as the young man knelt and swore to protect the innocent, to uphold justice, to be a shield for the helpless and a sword against the wicked. And when Tam rose and turned to face the assembled knights, his eyes met those of the man who had saved his mother and changed the course of his life. And no words were necessary between them. Each understood what the other had sacrificed, what they had gained, and what debts of honor could never be fully repaid, but must instead be passed forward to the next generation. In the years that followed, Sir Tam, as he came to be known, would become one of the Order's most dedicated knights, riding from town to town across the borderlands, answering pleas for help, standing between the strong and the weak, dispensing justice with a sword arm made strong by training and a heart made fierce by memory. He never forgot the lessons of that rainy night in Thornhaven, never forgot what it meant to be helpless and afraid, never forgot the sight of his mother's broken body or the sound of her whimpers. And because he remembered, because he carried those memories like sacred relics in the temple of his soul, he became exactly the kind of knight that the Order needed, the kind that the realm needed, the kind that frightened children running through the rain needed when all other hope had failed. The story of the boy and the knights passed into legend, told and retold until the details blurred and the truth became inseparable from myth. But those who had been there, who had witnessed the knights emerge from that building with blood on their armor and vengeance in their eyes, they knew the truth. They knew that sometimes mercy wore the face of wrath, that sometimes justice required the willingness to become monsters so that monsters might be destroyed, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the world was made right not through peaceful means, but through the calculated application of righteous violence. And on dark nights, when the rain fell like ice and the wind howled through the streets of Thornhaven, the citizens would sometimes speak of that evening years ago, would remind their children that while the world was often cruel and unjust, there were still those who fought against the darkness, who answered the cries of the helpless, who stood as living proof that not all men had abandoned honor and mercy and compassion. They would tell the story as a warning to those who would prey upon the innocent and as a comfort to those who feared that they stood alone against the terrors of the world. Because ultimately, that was the true power of what the knights had done that night. Not just the punishment they had inflicted upon 6 wicked men, but the message they had sent echoing through the years, that injustice would be answered, that cruelty would be met with retribution, that no one was so high that they stood above the reach of justice, and no one was so low that they stood beneath its protection. It was a message written in blood and steel and unwavering purpose, and it resonated in the hearts of all who heard it with the force of an unbreakable vow. The woman lived another 30 years after that terrible night, long enough to see her son rise through the ranks of the order, long enough to hold her grandchildren, long enough to find a measure of peace that she had thought forever lost. And when she died, it was in her sleep, in a warm bed, in a cottage provided by the order, with her son holding her hand and the knowledge in her heart that she had been loved and protected and valued, that her suffering had not been in vain, that from the ashes of her darkest hour had risen a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. Sir Aldrich had died 5 years before her, an old man finally laid to rest with full honours, his coffin draped in the silver and blue banner of the order, his sword and shield placed atop it as symbols of a life spent in service to ideals that transcended any single man. At his funeral, Sir Tam had spoken of the knight's mercy and justice, of how he had saved a frightened boy and his broken mother, of how one act of courage and compassion had changed the course of multiple lives. And in the chapel, listening to the young knight speak, the other members of the order had nodded in understanding, recognizing the truth that lay at the heart of their calling, that they were not heroes, not champions, not paragons of virtue, but simply men who tried to do right in a world that made doing right as difficult as possible. The Order of the Silver Lion endures to this day, riding the borderlands and beyond, answering the calls of those in need, standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. New knights join its ranks each year, taking the same oaths that Sir Aldrich and Sir Tam took, swearing to uphold justice and protect the helpless regardless of the cost. They carry on a tradition that stretches back centuries, a tradition born from the simple understanding that evil must be opposed, that cruelty must be answered, and that sometimes the only language that wicked men understand is the language of force. And somewhere, in the stories that mothers tell their children on dark nights, in the legends that are whispered in taverns and sung by minstrels, in the collective memory of a people who have known too much suffering and too little justice, the tale of the boy and the knight's lives on, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, even when all hope seems lost, there are still those who will answer, and when the innocent cry for help, who will risk everything to ensure that the guilty face consequences for their actions, and who will never, ever abandon those who have nowhere else to turn. Because that is what it means to be a knight, not the armor or the sword or the title, but the willingness to stand in the gap between the strong and the weak, to be the shield that protects and the sword that punishes, to remember that mercy and justice are not opposites, but two sides of the same coin, and that both are necessary if civilization is to endure. It means being willing to carry the weight of terrible choices, to live with the memory of violence done in service of good, to sacrifice pieces of your own soul so that others might keep theirs intact. It means being willing to run toward the screams when everyone else runs away. Thank you so much for listening to this tale from Medieval Stories. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and mercy and the price of standing up for what's right, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to our channel for more immersive medieval narratives. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in the knight's position? Do you think their actions were justified? Share your perspective with our community, and let's continue this conversation together.